Welcome to Dispatch Live. We've got a very special episode today, not just because this is open to everybody. So we probably have some first-time viewers, Dispatch Live viewers in the audience. Welcome. We're glad you're with us. We are going to be talking today exclusively about the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we're joined by two very special guests to do that, Bennett Murray and Tim Mack. Thank you guys for being here. Bennett is a freelance journalist based in Belgrade who has written, three pieces for us?
About four.
Four pieces. Most of them from the front lines in Ukraine, and the most recent we published yesterday. So it's on our homepage right now. You should go check it out. Tim is a journalist and former U.S. Army combat medic who founded the Counteroffensive, which is a indispensable Substack that's been reporting on the war in Ukraine for 2 years now at this point, right? And this is kind of a full circle moment for me. When I first started at the Dispatch 5 years ago and had no idea what I was doing, never been a reporter, Tim was on the Hill and showed me around. And showed me how to do a little bit of congressional reporting. So appreciated it then, appreciate the work that you're doing now, and glad that you're with us.
Always be nice to the new people. You never know when they'll become the executive editor of the Dispatch.
I did not know that at the time either. But to kick off the conversation, I want to pose a question to all of you guys that we also posed to readers of our Morning Dispatch newsletter yesterday, which is, what do you remember about the day Russia first invaded 2 years ago, and what has surprised you the most about the last 2 years? Tim, we could start with you because you were on the ground, right?
Yeah, I arrived on one of the last commercial flights into Kyiv, and I remember if you kind of think back to that point. There was actually a lot of U.S. intelligence community warnings about the impending full-scale invasion. And in fact, they had predicted that it would happen the week before. So by the time February 23rd, 24th rolls around, actually it's feeling kind of like a dud, like it's not going to happen at all. And I remember landing in Kyiv that night, and everyone was just telling me, well, you missed, I guess it's just not going to happen. I remember getting a drink with a friend of mine that evening. It was a guy who was a veteran war correspondent, and he had covered 17 different wars. He was about to cover his 18th, and he was saying to me very confidently, "Hey, it's not going to happen. You might be wasting your time here in Kyiv." But then that night at 3:00 in the morning, I got a call from one of my editors. Putin had just given an unhinged speech, and it really looked like something really bad was going to happen. And I remember waking up to my editor saying, "Hey, you got to get downstairs to a bomb shelter," and then started hearing for the first time air sirens, bombings in the city. And I remember I was just in so much shock. I didn't actually seek cover initially. I did what I always do when I wake up, and that is I went and I started brushing my teeth. I was in such shock. I didn't know what to do. I just was kind of on it. I just was brushing my teeth and staring at myself in the mirror, thinking, what is happening right now? And I didn't expect that 2 years later I'd still be covering this war.
Yeah. Bennett, were you over there at that point?
I was in Russia when it began. I had moved to Moscow a few months before on a fellowship that I had received initially in March 2020, which was a terrible time to receive a fellowship to be abroad. I was living in Ukraine at the time. It finally began in November, and on the night of February 23rd, all of us were being flown out to Altai Republic in Siberia for a planned trip that was just part of the fellowship's package. And it was a red-eye flight. We arrived, would have been about 9 a.m. local time. And I checked my phone because we all had bad vibes by then. I was working at the Moscow Times, just started there as part of my fellowship. So I had a sense that there was a fair chance of something terrible happening. Not that I knew it was going to happen or even thought it was likely to happen, but I knew there was like Russian roulette game, 1 out of 6 chance of everything going to, horrifically. And so we land, check my phone. We're about 20, 30 minutes off from the Putin speech. And all the people I'm following in Kiev, none of them know why yet, but they're all, word is already going around officially in Kiev that it was about to kick off. And so they all knew it was serious, and they're all staying up. And then we get out of the airport, get into our taxis to go to the breakfast. And that's when I see on my phone Putin addressing the nation. And so, there I was in Russia, and I was texting people frantically I knew in Ukraine, friends, because like I said, I lived there before. A week before the invasion, there was this Ukrainian woman who I'd met years ago in Vietnam. We've been friends, and I never, we kept in touch, but I hadn't seen her in a long time. I just messaged her asking her a week before, hey, are you in Ukraine? She's like, no, I'm in Budapest. I'm going back to Kyiv tomorrow. But should I? And I said, something's probably going to happen, and Kyiv could be in danger. So I would recommend you stay, visit your parents for the week. She lives in Western Ukraine. She's from Western Ukraine. And so I text her, after it all kicks off, and I don't know what to say to her in that situation. So I just say, God be with you. I don't even say that very often, but, and then, she gets, and she says, where are you? I'm like, where are you? She says, I'm with my parents. I go, thank God. And then she just says, to be honest, I can't believe. And I just said, no, I'm so sorry. And like the one tweet I put out that morning was just stop the Death Star. I want to get off on Alderaan. And so anyway, long story short, the fellowship ended almost immediately afterward, and which was fine by me. 10 days after the invasion, I was in Ukraine, and I stayed there for 3 months. I try to get there as much as I can. I have a fiance. Actually, she's Russian, and so we live in Serbia together, where we can be together. And most people don't actually want their partners to run off to war zones, so I don't torture her too much by doing it regularly. But I do come out I try to do it 2 months a year. So I've been in Ukraine cumulatively 6 months since the invasion began.
It's and we have been a beneficiary of you doing that. Your reporting from the front lines has been fantastic. We're very glad that we've been able to publish it. So I could ask the regular dispatch folks where you were on February 22nd or 23rd, 2022, but I don't think I was at a John Mayer concert. Steve called me, told me I had to leave to go write our morning newsletter and change it from where it was the day before. So Mary, I want to bring you into this.
I think I told you could stay for the rest of the concert, right? And then
I didn't listen to you. If that's what you did, he was playing "Waiting on the World to Change" while that call came in, and it did.
There are moments.
Yeah, but Mary, you wrote a really great TMD item for us yesterday, just kind of bringing readers up to speed on just where we are 2 years into this, and much more of a focus on the geopolitical shifts that we've seen over the last 2 years. Can you kind of summarize the top line takeaways from that, and we can get in a little bit to just where the actual war itself is, and kind of where morale is coming in?
Yeah, speaking of waiting on the world to change, it's it was actually sort of how I framed the piece for yesterday's TMD. So in the last 2 years, I think there have been some pretty dramatic geopolitical shifts. Obviously, we have the largest land war in Europe since World War II, and an unintended consequence of that, as far as I think Vladimir Putin was concerned, was that NATO was almost immediately united and strengthened in some pretty remarkable ways. Finland and Sweden moved to join. Finland did last year, and Sweden is on its way to doing so after Hungary and Viktor Orban removed his objection. So that's kind of an incredible thing to think about, this alliance expanding. But and on Putin's border as well, the Finland-Russia border, and Finland and Sweden, two pretty serious military heavyweights. But the flip side of that is it also, the longer the war has gone on, revealed some real fissures in NATO, particularly emanating from Capitol Hill, as we will talk about, I'm sure, and the increasing reluctance to supply Ukraine with American aid among a certain neo-isolationist group of Republicans. And also, Donald Trump is running for president. He has always been skeptical of NATO, and it seems like he is ramping up that rhetoric. We had a couple of weeks ago him tell a crowd in South Carolina that Putin could do whatever the hell he wanted to NATO allies who did not contribute 2% of their GDP to their own defense. So that's the sort of NATO picture. And then on the Russian side, there's been some interesting geopolitical developments there, where Russia has reached out to North Korea to provide artillery rounds. It has deepened its connection with Iran, who has been providing drones and will now provide as well missiles for use in Ukraine. And then there's this ongoing relationship with China. Before the war, that was Putin's last visit overseas. They pledged this no limits friendship. And as it turns out, one of the limits has been China providing lethal aid, which it has not, as far as we can tell, done. But what it has done is provide things like earth movers to dig trenches. And I'm sure Bennett and Tim could probably speak to some of this as well. But they are the lifeline for the Russian economy that has been very, very heavily sanctioned and continues to be very heavily sanctioned. Just yesterday, Biden administration slapped something like 500 additional sanctions on Putin's regime for the death of Alexei Navalny in a penal colony in Siberia. So there have been some pretty massive geopolitical shifts, some of which may endure, and some of which are causing a lot of uncertainty, especially along NATO's eastern flank, where allies are concerned about America's commitment to the war in Ukraine and to their future defense.
Bennett, speaking of that American commitment or lack thereof, the piece that you published for us yesterday, you talked to a lot of these Ukrainian soldiers just south of Bakhmut about this app, posing that question to them. Do they, what is their view of America? What is their view of the United States and the initial support, but then obviously the logjam that we've seen in Congress in recent weeks? Is that something that Ukrainian soldiers are paying very close attention to, and how is it actually tangibly impacting the war effort for Ukraine at this point?
Yes, they are paying very close attention. I would say they're mostly just very confused and shocked. I mean, this is a country where they recently renamed a street after Ronald Reagan. John McCain very famously visited the Maidan 2013, late 2013, I think it was, during the protests against Yanukovych, and generally is very pro-American. And they've also received a steady visit of bipartisan delegations. They've had Biden, McConnell, all these fellows coming out to support Ukraine. And so if you weren't really following the details of American congressional politics with MTG and people like that on kind of the the fringes, it's kind of blindsiding to suddenly have all this come out into the open, and to see that, oh wow, some people really don't like us there, and we don't know why or understand what we did. And so yeah, because the impact is very obvious when you go out there, compared to previous times. You just hear a lot more. The incoming outgoing ratio has just become much more skewed, where they'll be shot at with artillery, and whereas typically then you do a counter battery mission to just hit back, try to suppress it or hit them. Now they just kind of have to take it a lot more and just sort of like hunker down and not retaliate because of the lack of munitions. And I mean, there is always shortages of ammunition. I mean, even without this political reality right now, there still just isn't enough shell production happening. But it was better than it was by a pretty big margin. And so it has just changed the sort of the tenor of combat now. And they're using things, like I said in the article, like they're using things like BMP autocannons, where really they should be using mortars and stuff like that to compensate. And so it's grim. And they're really confused and upset.
Tim, both on the battlefield and in civilian centers in Kyiv, what is morale like 2 years in? Obviously, Ukraine put up much more of a fight than I think most Western observers expected, probably most Ukrainians expected. But it really has ground to a stalemate in recent months, and it's with this lack of continued American assistance and the future in doubt. Where are Ukrainians on the state of the war? Are they more resigned to an eventual defeat? Do they still feel that same sense of optimism that they did in the first couple of days, or how do they see the next couple months playing out?
Well, I don't think they're resigned to defeat. And the vast majority of Ukrainians, according to polling, still want to fight on. So this is not an issue of, hey, Ukrainians are suddenly willing to start negotiating with Putin. But I will have to say, just anecdotally, having had many conversations with folks in the political sphere, on the military side, that morale is about as bad as it's been since the full-scale invasion began. And I think much of the coverage is understated just how bad it is. The United States finds itself in a position right now where it could be turning, due to congressional inaction, a strategic victory into a terrible strategic defeat in the long term. That Ukrainians, if they are to fall back or for one reason or another required to seek a humiliating negotiated end to this war, they're going to be looking for answers on why it is that happened. And I think it's a pretty fair answer to say that inadequate Western Western execution of aid delivery and broken promises was a key component of that. And the strategic defeat won't be limited just to Ukraine. It'll reverberate across the world. You see Chinese official media already saying that what's happening in Ukraine is a warning to Taiwan. That when the United States says that it will support its allies, it doesn't really mean it in the long term. It only means it for as long as the cause is popular enough. This should be a deeply concerning thing to all Americans, not just American legislators. And I think that ultimately a lot of Ukrainians may come around to the view espoused by Russian propagandists, which is that the United States encouraged Ukraine to resist, encouraged Ukraine to fight back, and provided just enough weaponry for thousands of Ukrainians to die, and then stepped back and didn't follow through on its final promises. And that should worry everyone who is concerned about America's role in the world. And what's interesting is that I've really seen that Ukrainians, a lot of non-Americans follow American politics to a like dizzying degree of specificity, right? I was in Taiwan a couple months ago, and I was having lunch with someone, and they prefaced a statement by saying, "Oh, well, as of course you know, as Newt Gingrich said in mid-90s in his contract with America." And actually today I was talking to someone who was bragging to me about how closely they followed American politics. And I said, okay, quick, who won the American presidential election in 1976? And they correctly said Jimmy Carter. So I was very impressed by this. A person who, reads about politics in Ukraine would know the answer to that question, but not by
Steve
no
wouldn't know
means
the
like
answer
a
to that
professor. There are a lot of Americans who wouldn't be able to. There are a lot of Americans who wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Yes. Well, I want to bring Steve and Jonah into this. This is probably the longest they've gone on a Dispatch Live without being brought into the conversation. But
And Jonah for sure.
The point that Tim raised there about Russia propaganda and how the United States has approached Ukraine over the past 2 years and last 6 months, the right-wing critics of additional aid make a similar point to that this war is pointless at this point. Russia has more bodies to throw into the meat grinder, and they're going to win this war of attrition. Why should we prolong it? And why are we sending more Ukrainian men to their death? And I don't know that the proponents of additional aid have made the strategic case in the way that it needs to be made, and this comes from the Biden administration. I think they haven't put forward this is why we are continuing to fund, so that we can get to X outcome. What is that X outcome? Is a prolonged stalemate a good signal to send to China? Is it eventually we can wear down the Russian troops? What is the case that Biden administration officials can make to skeptical Republicans of additional aid?
Is that to me and Steve?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Just very quickly on this, I don't know at this point. I think Biden has messed this up so badly. I don't know at this point that the Republicans who are on record saying they're against supporting Ukraine can be persuaded to be for supporting Ukraine. And the big tell there is that they lie so much about the actual facts on the ground, right? And so the idea that they would be open to good faith persuasion with better arguments and more relevant facts when they're willing to lie now tells me that they're just bought in. This is a Trump politics politicized thing. And so I don't know that Biden should spend very much time trying to convince those people of anything. And I'm not sure politicians should ever try to spend a lot of time actually trying to convince other politicians. What politicians should do is convince the voters that those politicians care about. And that's an easier task. That's a doable task. The polling suggests that America is much more sympathetic to Ukraine than you would guess from these self-declared tribunes of the people like J.D. Vance want to suggest they are. And I think Biden could give assuming that he could get his B-12 shots or whatever, but if he's up for the task, if he could give us persuasive speech from the Oval Office, he could go over the heads of the Republican caucus and make the case for a discharge petition. I think there are enough Republican votes to join with Democrats to do that. And just simply say, look, here are the 10, just crib off of Luke Coffey or somebody else, or Mike Gallagher or Mitt Romney can do this, chapter and verse very easily of how, as a matter of realpolitik, it's in our interest not to see Ukraine defeated. As a matter of our principles and our ideals, as a matter of our integrity and our honor, as a matter of our long-term strategic interest in seeing Russia's military capacity degraded. You can go through a whole list of these things pretty easily that I think would be pretty persuasive to the median voter in a way that could force essentially a discharge petition, which is all that we really need at this point.
Right, and for viewers, a discharge petition would allow. Currently, the reason that additional aid to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel is being held up in Congress is because House Speaker Mike Johnson won't bring it up for a vote. It passed the Senate by a pretty large margin. I think it was like 70 to 29. But because of the politics surrounding the issue, particularly with respect to Ukraine, Mike Johnson has not brought it up for a vote. A discharge petition would allow basically a group of lawmakers, I think it's a simple majority, but would require Republicans to team up with Democrats and probably more Republicans than you might think, because there are Democrats who oppose the aid to Israel as well, but basically bypass Mike Johnson and bring it to the floor anyways, at which point it would probably pass.
Right. The salient point is if you had a secret ballot on the floor, if you had a secret vote, aid to Ukraine would pass pretty decisively. And it just tells you what the politics are, that a public vote, it's a bit more complicated thing. That's my only point.
Steve, what is driving those politics?
Yeah, I was going to say, probably it's the case that some of the people who are publicly making a case against additional funding for Ukraine would vote in favor of additional funding for Ukraine because they think it's the right thing to do. They just don't think it'll help them get elected. I agree with Jonah entirely. I mean, I don't think Joe Biden should spend a minute trying to persuade the sort of neo-isolationist right that this is worth doing and that this is worth funding. They've gone so far as to try to recast the Ukrainians, the victims here, the ones who were invaded, as the villains. They're not serious. It's bad faith. I think most of them know it. There's no point. But I do think there's a real opportunity to make a very strong public argument for all the reasons that Jonah laid out, and I won't repeat. The problem is, it's increasingly hard to believe 2 years in that that would reflect Joe Biden's conviction on the issue. And I think that I'm very sympathetic to the critique of the Biden administration's handling of the war, that they are and have from the beginning been trying to pursue a position to help Ukraine not lose the war, not to help Ukraine win the war. And I think, there was a lot made of this then. We haven't heard as much about it since, but you remember about a month before the actual invasion, Joe Biden made this offhand comment about a potential minor incursion as he was thinking about what might happen with respect to Russia. And, it I think, unfortunately revealed a mindset from the Biden administration that suggested something less than a fully supportive, enthusiastic backing of Ukraine. I would love to see Joe Biden make a real strategic and moral case for why we should be supporting Ukraine more. And I'm fascinated to hear from both Tim and Bennett just how much people are paying attention to that on the ground. I mean, it really does matter. And I'd be interested if Joe Biden did make such a case. In your thoughts, Declan and Tim and Ben and the others, what could he say that would make the Ukrainians believe that the United States was really committed in the way that we would need to be committed to win? I'd be interested in any thoughts especially from over in Ukraine on that.
I think you're muted, Declan.
Whoops. I was just saying, Tim or Bennett, if either of you have thoughts on that question, what I distinctly remember very early on when aid first passed, that there were Ukrainians singing the praises of the Americans and the Biden administration and what they've been doing. Has that Tim, you said they're paying very close attention to American politics. Yeah. Are Ukrainians making a distinction between President Biden?
They've forgotten that this, that the aid to Ukraine prior to the full-scale invasion was provided very reluctantly and in very limited amounts, until the Ukrainians themselves proved that they could resist even without weaponry. And it was only then that the United States stepped in to start, and the rest of the West stepped in to provide armored vehicles and tanks. One of the stories we did at counteroffensive.news is a deep dive into the Battle of Antonov Airfield, and that is, the first 72 hours of the invasion. Putin's most elite soldiers, the VDV airborne troops, they try to land at this airfield just northwest of Kyiv. The Ukrainian troops there, are terribly equipped. They don't have what they need to shoot down the armored helicopters that are coming in and swooping over the airfield and just destroying everything. There's this anecdote from our reporting in which one soldier fighting on the Ukrainian side has been shuttling ammo back and forth all day, and without ammo sees a Russian soldier on the edge of the airfield. Doesn't have anything to fire, in his rifle, so he steps on the gas of his black BMW and just runs this group of Russian soldiers over. And that says something to me, actually, about it reflects a quote I heard very early in the full-scale invasion, that as long as there's a 12-year-old boy with a plastic butter knife in Ukraine, there's going to be resistance, and that the Ukrainians will do whatever they can, and they certainly have the will to fight, and will fight to the death to defend their country, their sovereignty, their language, their culture. But they don't have the ammo, they don't have the rounds, they don't have the ability to go round for round when it comes to the artillery duel in the east. They don't have the long-range missiles they need when they see a concentration of Russian soldiers or high-ranking officials in Crimea, for example, to be able to use these long-range missiles effectively. And the longer that they don't have it, they're going to start slipping, and we can already start see the effects of that slippage as Russia makes some limited gains, but gains that have been quite damaging to Ukrainian morale, as there's no certainty in the aid. So Ukraine can't make a long-term strategy for what they're going to do in the future because they don't know what they're going to get.
So, Tim, I'd love to jump in here, and Bennett as well, to your point about long-term strategy. A couple of weeks ago, Zelensky replaced his top general, Valery Zaluzhny, with Alexander Syrskyi. I hope I'm getting those pronunciations correct. But I'm wondering, with a couple of weeks gone now since that move was officially announced, what does it look like the actual strategic change might be with Zaluzhny versus Syrskyi? It's been pretty well reported that Syrskyi is not terribly popular with the rank and file. But just at a very high level, what might this signal about the direction of the war? Are we starting to see any of that already? Would love to know your thoughts, because I think in the West it was initially sort of reported more as a challenge of personalities more than maybe clarity about what it would mean strategically.
Bennett was just in the East, so why don't I let him kind of comment on what the folks on the front lines are talking about. But I'll say that in Kyiv, I haven't spoken to anyone who thought that relieving Zaluzhny was a good idea. I mean, the only figure in Ukraine that had a higher approval rating than Zaluzhny, had higher trust from Ukrainians than President Zelensky was Zaluzhny. So this is a much beloved military figure being relieved over what looks to be politics, what looks to be Zaluzhny making the classic political blunder of accidentally telling the truth, which is to say that the war is in a stalemate and they need more help. The political class didn't like that. They also didn't like the military plan to conscript another 500,000 soldiers. That's deeply unpopular, as you can imagine, among the Ukrainian population. And part of that is because there is no strategy, right? That if you're trying to reach out and conscript people from the civilian population, you want to be able to tell them, hey, we have a plan for what we're going to do with your lives. other than digging some trenches and hoping to hold the territory and that you won't be wiped out. That strategy may exist, but I haven't heard it. I haven't seen it. So I think that's probably deeply concerning to a lot of soldiers on the front line and contributing to some of the skepticism of Syrskyi and the Ukrainian political class.
Yeah, talking to some of the guys just this last week on the front who I know, it's not as if Syrskyi is a dumb guy or that he can't potentially do well from what I was these guys who I know and trust, but rather the fact that it's so trusted means that you lose something and you can't just replicate that in a new guy. I mean, Syrskyi his reputation is, he's a bit older than Zaluzhny, and older in the sense that he got his officer in Moscow, whereas Zaluzhny was just sort of the first generation. I think he's at Union, but then it collapsed by the time he graduated, something like that. He's much more in Soviet dogma, basically, than and so that could be a play. I mean, seriously, he definitely did get blamed within the ranks for a lot of the deaths we saw last year. And yeah, he has credibility issues. They're not necessarily because he's a bad general. We'll just have to see how that plays out.
So I have a kind of strange question for both Tim and Bennett. It's very frustrating having, I think I was pretty clear, I have a lot of disdain for a lot of the most passionate opponents of helping Ukraine, because I think a lot of them just argue in bad faith. I mean, you can see the bad faith in part when J.D. Vance refuses to actually just hear out Zelensky in Munich, and when you scratch the surface even slightly on most of the things that people are saying, the blank check stuff, all of these things, you just realize that they're not actually doing their homework and trying to come up with a real argument. They've reached a conclusion and they're working backwards. That said, I do have friends and acquaintances and people I know who are pretty principled opponents on a more realpolitik kind of stance about helping Ukraine. And even they often will grab arguments that I don't know enough about the things they're bringing up to tell necessarily whether there's merit to them. And so, for example, I've had to do a lot of my own sort of homework on the Russian Orthodox Church banning stuff, and it's not what the opponents of aiding Ukraine say, but it's also complicated, And similarly, they'll say, "Well, look, he hasn't called for elections." All of these kinds of things. There are these. So anyway, I'm just wondering. Obviously, Ukraine still has a corruption problem. Zelensky has admitted it. Senior officials admitted it. But what are some of the criticisms of Ukraine as a partner that you think have some merit, that are worth sort of pointing out, that are worth sort of, addressing in in an honest and clear-eyed way? We didn't do a lot of that, those of us who supported the Iraq War, until it was way too late, and that created all sorts of a problem for the narrative that followed from it. So what are some things that you think Zelensky and his government are actually vulnerable to some legitimate criticisms that may not rise to the level of saying, and therefore we shouldn't help, but are worth sort of addressing, that diplomats are addressing behind the scenes?
Corruption is a big issue, obviously, as you point out, right? That this is a country that still has a lot of these vestiges of the Soviet era that continue to today. But that said, I mean, it's not such a serious problem that we're seeing, javelins being sold in Romania or anything, or any sort of. There's no concrete evidence of corruption leading to American military aid or Western military aid, not getting to where it needs to go, or being diverted. What we're seeing when it comes to issues of corruption is Ukrainian officials trying their best to publicize when they find that corruption. And I think that's actually a reflection of a healthy democratic government. And when we look at the kinds of corruption that are happening, it's this Soviet-style contract corruption. For example, we don't have to get into the details, but ordering 10,000 winter jackets at a certain price and pocketing the difference, or getting foodstuffs for the front lines and pocketing the difference between what you say it cost and what it actually cost. Some Ukrainian officials have been guilty of that, and they've been tagged for that. That is one serious issue. But on the democracy issue, it's been pointed out that there were supposed to be elections in March of this year, but the Ukrainian constitution actually explicitly prohibits elections during a period of war. Surveys in Ukraine show pretty handily that Ukrainians don't feel that it's appropriate to have elections right now. I've had a lot of heated debates with my Ukrainian friends about this particular question, and they make a couple objections, and one of which is that it's legally impermissible. Another is that it would be impossible to effectively allow soldiers in the front lines to vote. And then, of course, there's the issues of the occupied territories and how and whether they would have voice. Folks in occupied areas of Zaporizhia or in Donbass behind Russian lines would be disenfranchised. And so, how do you deal with those issues? They're legitimate questions, and I think the West is going to continue to push for that. But I've pointed out that the United States did hold elections during the Civil War, but the UK didn't during World War II. So it's kind of hard to point fingers and saying in the midst of this bloody war where likely hundreds of thousands of people have been killed or injured, that they need to follow our standards of democratic governance to a T, even as they're kind of sweating and bleeding and dying on the front lines. I think that's a bit much to ask.
I want to encourage, if there are viewers in the chat, please send your questions there as well. We'll try to get some of those asked of Bennett and Tim. Until then, what are you guys going to be looking for in the next couple weeks, in the next couple months? With stalemates, that there's by definition not a lot of major progress being made in one direction or another. We saw the fall of Divka. I think that's how that's pronounced, but correct me if I'm wrong. In recent days, do you see that as kind of the beginning of another Russian counteroffensive or offensive? With the change in military leadership, are we going to see a big shift in approach on the Ukrainian side? What are you keeping an eye on for the next couple weeks and months?
Well, if Russia manages to large spaces of land through it, because it hasn't really middle of 2022, so coming up on 2 years, seeing big breakthroughs where Russia not only takes a town like Avdiivka or Bakhmut, but actually crushes through the line and takes 12 kilometers. I was in Avdiivka 11 months ago, the week after the Russians took the north flank and had the city surrounded on 3 sides. And I mean, it was the worst thing I've in Ukraine. I mean, I felt lucky to get out there alive, to be honest. And me and my team were speculating openly. I think if is going to fall before Bakhmut does. This is insane. 11 months later, it finally fell. And I'm just watching all 11 months, and it's still in Ukrainian hands. I mean, I went out in October not to the city, but in the direction, talk to the 47th Brigade. Yeah, it's going to fall. It's just a matter of when. And just the amount they. And so, I mean, the Avdiivka fall, just like the Bakhmut fall, was totally predictable. it was a question of how much they could bleed out Russia in the meantime and how much they could preserve troop strength and what point the ratio stopped making sense. And but yeah, if they're open countryside again, like they did with the Papa back in the day, then yeah, that's serious stuff going on. But if it keeps on, the attrition keeps on going, especially if the shell situation isn't resolved right away. If they manage to keep Russia at bay with what they have right now for, you know, a month or two or even longer, and then hopefully by then we get some discharge pitches going on. I mean, that's going to be impressive, and it's going to bode well for future options, I think.
Tim, go ahead.
I am you know, what I'm thinking about is, have Ukrainian forces, what I'm going to be going to Kharkiv and the east and trying to understand a little bit better is whether or not Ukrainian forces have spent enough time creating the defensive fortifications that they need in order to hold back a potential Russian advance. And it's not clear to me that it has, and it's a question that's still you know, really unanswered for me. But you know, talking to some Ukrainian soldiers, there's a lot of concern that because Ukraine has been so confident in making gains during its counteroffensive, that very little effort was spent on defense and building, you know, the necessary work of trenches and fortifications when it starts to go, if it were to start to go the other way, that it wasn't really even considered as a serious possibility. And so now Ukrainians are in the very desperate situation of trying to do this on the fly instead of having these fortifications ready. I don't know if you experienced any of these concerns, Bennett, but it, you know, from my perspective, talking to some of these soldiers, this was really expressed to me that the Ukrainian military had not gone through contingency planning, that it was kind of seeing success and victory as almost a given before it even happened, and now we're in a deeply troublesome situation.
We did get some questions in the chat. Thank you for those. From King Benayan, what do you see as the economic impact when you visit Kyiv or Kharkiv and some of the more rural areas? Tim, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. And I'd love to have Bennett's views on this as well. It seems like every time I go walk around Kyiv, I see something else closing down. Obviously, the economic impact of having a large proportion of your population become refugees, and then another large portion be conscripted or volunteer to go off to war is going to have a terrible economic impact. Right now, you know, businesses are you know, in large part staying above water, but that's not sustainable in the long term. Obviously, no investor wants to invest in Ukraine when there's no certainty over how long the war will be, whether their assets can be safe, and what the future for the country. Ukraine has a really very dazzling economic future ahead of it if the war can end. I mean, it has a highly educated population, it has obviously very motivated civilian population, and you know, if it enters the EU, if it manages to get the security guarantees it needs, it will boom like South Korea after that war ended. But right now, Kyiv is struggling. The rural areas are struggling the worst, and it's actually the rural areas are where a lot of the conscription occurs, and where a lot of the original volunteers came from as well. And so they're probably disproportionately getting hit you know, even worse than places like Kyiv or Kharkiv.
Yeah, it's not a zombie land, but it's a wartime economy. And so you go to a place like Kramatorsk, you know, which is just about, I don't know, 25 kilometers from the front, and it's the largest city in Donbass, it's still in Ukrainian hands. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, you'll see like a tattoo parlor just opened up from some woman from Kiev came by to open up shop, or new restaurants and stuff like that. But it's just the war economy funding this. All these soldiers paying their paychecks, families coming out, and so that's kind of the. And you do see like where that makes sense. Money's changing hands. But yeah, as Tim says, I mean, I can't imagine you can really get insurance companies to underwrite new projects right now in Ukraine, or much of anything in that regard at all. And so it's not good. I mean, it's just the war economy and pretty much just that alone keeping everything alive, which is not sustainable at all. And that's also again, it's back to the whole questions of aid, particularly financial aid from the EU and stuff like that. I mean, that's kind of keeping things alive. That's keeping the paychecks to soldiers going and to bureaucrats, and they in turn support the businesses, like the shops, the stores. So yeah, and of course, some of the farmers just go about their daily lives. They farm, they export. And we've even seen up near the front, you'll even have sometimes farmers under shelling try to keep on going. So it's very tenacious of them. But obviously, yes, in many cases, it's no longer an option. So yeah, it's not great by any means. No.
I'd love to follow up on this question so one of the great victories of the last 2 years for Ukraine has been pushing Russia away from their coast in the Black Sea, this country without a navy, managing to regain control enough to resume a pretty significant amount of their exports, including of grain. Does that, what kind of difference does that make for people, individuals across the country, and just your thoughts on their ability to do that without a navy?
It's a symbolic win, but obviously the volume of grain that can be exported remains just a small trickle as compared to pre-war levels. And then, of course, the movement of grain and trucking from Ukraine into the EU by land has caused a series of confrontations, including Polish truckers who are now blockading the Ukrainian border. And so these issues of trade, of EU integration, of grain, and the future of Ukraine, they're all like intimately related. Ukraine has been able to kind of create a buffer zone off its coast, and it's a tremendous achievement. And they're certainly better off right now than if Russian vessels were able to loiter closer to the coast and fire long-range missiles at population centers all across Ukraine. But that said, the Russians still have other capabilities, and they still have access to territory in Belarus, for example. They still have access to large areas of the Black Sea. And what we're seeing is that while the Ukrainian economy is suffering, I'm just making up numbers here. If the Ukrainian economy is suffering 40%, the Russian economy is suffering only 10%. Due to sanctions, and in the long term, and in an economic battle of attrition, Russia has the upper hand. That Western sanctions haven't had sufficient teeth, and that the economic effects in Ukraine are just grinding.
We've got another question here from Eric that's a little bit more logistical for Tim and Bennett. Do either of you speak Ukrainian and or Russian, and kind of walk us through your reporting process as you're both talking to soldiers and civilians? And I'm sure a lot of them speak English too, but what has that experience been like?
Bennett, do you want to pick up on this one first, or do you want me to?
Oh, yeah. Bennett, you want to grab that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I speak some Russian. I'm not fluent yet. I only started when I turned 30. But I mean, I have the ambition to become fluent, and also I'm marrying into a Russian-speaking family, so yeah, a lot of reasons to learn Russian. And I don't speak Ukrainian, unfortunately. So what I can do is I can come around with my phone, my microphone, walk up to some guy on the street, turn it on. They don't speak English. I can give them the questions. I can ask them, when I don't understand the reply, I'll just go back in my house, translate the best as I can. If I really struggle with something, I'll call my fiance to help me. The issue is though is that in Ukraine, a lot of people, particularly in the countryside, they speak what's called Syriac, which is a hybrid language of Russian and Ukrainian. And it also varies throughout the country what kind of hybrid ratios and mixes are. And there's no dictionary for that. I mean, it's just across the board. They'll use like false friends. And so it can get kind of wild trying to figure that stuff out. But yeah, I do my best.
I'm learning Ukrainian. I don't speak Ukrainian anywhere near the level that's required to report. So I've had, I was originally in Ukraine for NPR as a correspondent, and I've had an interpreter and colleague of mine who's worked with me this entire time, and later joined me at the counteroffensive. And we have a newsroom of 5 people, other than me, all Ukrainian. And so we get by, but it's obviously enormously challenging to report things like we've done war crimes investigations and battlefield analysis and history, and that stuff is really can get very technical, and you could things do get lost in translation from time to time, so you have to be quite careful, and it's just another layer of complexity to the job of reporting.
I definitely encourage everybody who's watching to subscribe to the counteroffensive. We excerpted it, that piece on Antonov airfield in yesterday's Morning Dispatch. So you can find it through there. It's really an invaluable resource and important to keep up to date on what's happening on the ground there. We might run a few minutes late or long just to get some of your questions in. But we're wrapping up soon. Jared Painter asks, what would be the most valuable military equipment that could give Ukraine on a bang for buck basis? Bennett, you were just on the front lines. What are they clamoring for the most?
I mean, this is a kind of a boring answer, but shells. I mean, I can't say that too many times. But to give a more interesting answer too after that, what we've seen after Avdiivka or in Avdiivka is the Russians really kind of got glide rockets, perfected the art of launching these missiles from planes at the enemy, the Ukrainians, and they expect more of that to come. And so what they would really love are F-16s right now to, if not get air superiority, they can at least keep the Russian jets from getting too close to the front to relieve some pressure in that regard. That's my snappy answer for right now.
Tim, do you have anything to add on that, or should we move to?
I think Ukrainians would joke that they want their nuclear missiles back or their nuclear weapons back.
Bang for buck, definitely, yeah.
But I think short answer would be they're running low on Patriot missile ammunition. That's critical for defending civilian populations in major population centers. They'd probably ask for as many long-range missiles in the categories of ATACMS and HIMARS as they can get. And one thing that's really been a game changer in this war is the decentralized production of FPV drones that if you have the technical equipment, you can put together FPV drones in your kitchen. Actually, this is a counteroffensive story that's coming down the line, is this decentralized network of people just putting together and DIYing the creation of the manufacturing of lethal FPV drones for the front lines.
Can I make one point just to pick up on what Tim and Bennett said? I mean, they're the experts, but it's just worth pointing out, like, our lack of giving them F-16s, and there are good arguments and bad arguments about all that. The things that we've expected Ukraine to do on the ground, the U.S. military would never do without first establishing air supremacy. And it's just like, it's completely counter to our doctrine. And so when you hear a lot of people bemoaning or complaining that the Ukrainians weren't able to do what the U.S. could do, keep in mind, the U.S. wouldn't be able to do it either without air supremacy. And a lot of people ended up in a sausage grinder precisely because the Ukrainians couldn't protect their own people from the air the way U.S. military doctrine demands that be established first. I think it's just an important point to remind people.
Absolutely. And with that, I know you need to bounce for CNN. So if you want more Jonah, you can get it on whatever channel that is for you, wherever you're watching from. We've got a couple more here. Justin.
Seek medical attention if you demand more Jonah. But thank you, guys.
Thanks for joining us. Justin has a question, and I'm going to direct this to you, Mary. He asks, why isn't the fact that much or most aid to Ukraine would actually end up benefiting blue-collar American industry and workers being made? And we can plug a podcast that we just ran that you hosted with Mark Cancian. It's on the Dispatch podcast feed this morning. Can you explain a little bit of how this actual aid would be allocated and what its purpose is and how it gets the aid to Ukraine?
Yeah. So, very briefly, because it is a complicated process, if the aid as it's laid out in the Senate version of this bill comes to pass, about 60% of that money is actually spent in the United States in order to replace the things that we are sending to Ukraine. So, if we send them 1 million 155 millimeter artillery shells, a lot of the money in this bill would go to an artillery manufacturing plant in the heartland, where we will backfill those 1 million shells. The end of the question is, why isn't it being made? That's probably for the pundits. But, I think Jonah made a pretty good point about, and Steve too, just about the relatively bad faith in a lot of these arguments. I think, JD Vance knows that a lot of this, could be spent at an ammunition plant in his home state, if such a plant exists. And that's not an argument he makes.
So we've got time for two more. We've got Theron Scott asking, it appears the deficit of artillery vis-a-vis Russia cannot be overcome anytime soon, if ever. I think that's an important point, that even if this discharge position does come to pass, additional aid gets allocated. It's not like, okay, it shows up tomorrow on the front lines. This is a long process with real lag times, both in transit but also manufacturing, as Mary just mentioned. What is Plan B for the Ukrainian military? Tim, do you want to grab that one?
Sure. The drone warfare has absolutely changed the whole nature of modern combat. And if you can have an explosive device pick up from where you are standing and fly directly and see exactly where it will go and drop in the exact location that you want it to be, artillery looks a little bit 20th century compared to that, right? You need to use fewer rounds to achieve the same effect, and you're able to be much more precise and devastating when it comes to the impact you can inflict on the enemy. And so without FPV drones right now, I think the Ukrainians would already be retreating from their defense lines in the east. I think it's one of the critical things that are right now helping Ukrainians hold the line, because they don't have the artillery to do it. And right now, I mean, in Ukrainian kitchens and living rooms, people are, putting these drones together and trying to help the guys on the front lines.
Just very quickly, yes, exactly what I heard this last week. Guys say if it wasn't for the FPVs, we'd be lost. They're like way cheaper per round too, and they're not regulated because they're drones, they're not weapons. So you have the money, you can just buy thousands of them to Ukraine.
Yeah, there's a great anecdote in your piece, Bennett. His name was Soldatic. That's the call time. Yeah, could you tell viewers a little bit about what you saw and kind of how that plays out on the trenches? Yeah,
so I went out for the day with a FPV team for a hunt, and they just waited around until they got the targets, and they would go out and fly and try to hit them. I mean, the downside is that it's not foolproof. There are ways to counteract them, and sometimes if you break a line of sight, then yeah, it's not going to work. But But yeah, I mean, they're quite optimistic. I mean, about this one areas of bright spot they have going on is that they can get FPVs in the sky and they can get tanks at bay. They can, I mean, and psychologically it's terrifying because you have to deal with that too on that side. And the change of the war from when I was here a year ago, before that was really a big thing yet, and now, I mean, when I'm walking around within artillery range, it's like, like FPV drones, where are they? Oh no. But yeah, it works both ways, and it probably benefits Ukraine as a net gain on the whole if they exist now.
This last question is for Jonah and Steve, but now just for Steve. So it's from Allison Trimble, and she asks, what can those of us in congressional districts and states whose representatives are in favor of Ukraine aid and discharge petition do to move members of Congress opposed to the aid?
It's a good question from somebody who it's a very good question from somebody who strikes me as very smart. I'm glad the question wasn't, when can Mary get her raise? It's okay, Mary. My parents jump in with questions all the time. Yeah, I mean, you know, the traditional sort of letter writing campaigns. There's phone calls. They do log these phone calls, and I hate to sound defeatist about it, but let me sound defeatist about it. I think so many of the positions that these politicians, particularly the ones who are opposed to Ukraine aid and are vilifying the Ukrainians, are not based on reality and are not based on sort of a careful weighing of the relative merits of the positions of various sides. They're doing it because it'll get them on television. Donald Trump is telling them that they should make this argument. It's just a sort of crass political case. So I'm not convinced that will do a lot of good to make those calls. I do think you know, there are things you can do. You know, Tim's reporting is fantastic and is funded. Tim, you can talk a little bit more about this if you want. Funded by readers. He's over there doing this good work. He started a company to do this good work, and I think supporting journalists like that to help us actually get to the ground truth is really important. So and Bennett, I'm not sure. I know we help by paying you for your great work, but I'm sure there are ways that people could help there too. So sorry I don't have a more optimistic answer on our legislators, but there are ways to help for sure.
Tim,
I'll take the plug. And I'll add one, which is that you could subscribe at www.counteroffensive.news. Yes. And what we do is we specialize in deeply reported human stories of the war. So rather than, you know, what a lot of the other major news outlets are doing, we zoom in on a single person going through the news and then try to explore the news through their feelings and experiences and emotions and try to get break through this problem of Ukraine fatigue by telling stories that would be interesting to read, whether they were set in Ukraine or not. That's something that we've been really focused on doing over the last year.
And you do a very good job of it. Bennett, do you have anything that you'd like to plug before we wrap up tonight?
No. I have a plan for grad school. I'm leaving journalism.
Well, you should all go read his piece on on the homepage of our website right now. So thank you so much for joining us, Bennett and Tim. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. I thought this was a really productive conversation and one that's lacking in many parts of the media ecosystem. So reminder that we'll be doing another Dispatch Live tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. That will not feature most of the people on this panel. That's Steve, Jonah, Sarah, and Mike talking about the future of conservatism and the Republican Party. And if this was your first episode, I really encourage you to become a full member of the Dispatch. We do stuff like this all the time, and signing up will also get you access to all of our written work as well. So thank you very much for being here. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great rest of your weekend.
Thanks, guys. Stay safe.
Thank you.